Hey everybody, I'm Sarah, Lonesome Glory, and today we're going to talk about which mold I think the rotating draft surprise will be at this year's BreyerFest. So if you watch my previous BreyerFest videos, you know that my surprise model picks are based on some not so scientific science. This year it's even all pretty and color coded, just so I could keep myself in line. I will let you know, I do have two separate ideas for what I think Breyer might do this year. So I'm going to start with my very straightforward, which one do I think it's going to be pick. And then I'll tell you about my little kind of out there conspiracy theory. I don't think it's super likely, but I figured I'd share. In order to determine which molds were going to be available for Breyer to use as the surprise model, I first had to get a whole list of the traditional scale molds that Breyer makes. So I'm not sure who's doing Identifier Breyer currently, but that was my starting point. So many thanks to them. After getting everything set up and counted out, I determined that there are 178 traditional scale Breyer molds, but some of them just aren't going to be used as the surprise model. So based on what Breyer's done in the past, I made a grouping of criteria to help me start marking horses off of that list. So the first 4 or 5 are pretty much the givens. This is a thing that I can't see Breyer breaking this unwritten rule. For example, I don't believe that the surprise model would ever be a foal. Not with the price tag and not with the way they've done things in the past. So I don't see that happening. I don't really see it being a pony or one of the other equine creatures that isn't actually a horse. So I don't think it's going to be like Bridie of the Grand Canyon, for example. I also cannot see Breyer ever reusing a surprise model. So molds that have previously been a surprise at BreyerFest, I took off the list. Finally, I took off the list anything that is in the current lineup for BreyerFest 2022 special models. There's not that many of them, but it still helped me narrow it down. And finally, and this is where things get a little dodgy, I scratched off anything that was released as an auction model. The problem with doing that is that Breyer has not finished really letting us know what those auction models are. So it's entirely possible that by the time this video goes out, my main pick will have shown up in the auction and will no longer be my pick. So I'm going with what I have today. There are, I believe, 7 or 8 that they've released, but we'll get into numbers in a minute. So after I took off the models that were related to those categories, I looked at a few other categories that I just didn't think were too likely. But rather than really going into that, let's just start kind of at the beginning. The first category that's going to knock horses off of the list for surprise model is foals. I just don't see it happening. So I marked them all off on my handy spreadsheets, and there are 23 foal molds. So those are gone. That leaves me with 155 traditionals, which is still way too many. After that, I took off anything that was a pony or donkey or other creature, which there are 18 of those molds. Now we're down to 137. Still too many to really talk about them in detail. The next category is prior surprise. And this is the one that actually surprised me a little bit. I guess I just didn't realize that Breyer has been doing surprise models at BreyerFest for 13 years. But they have. And that's how many models I took off the list. I will say I did not include things that had been treasure hunt regular run models for that category. So We're now down to 124. After that, I took off the BreyerFest special run models from this year, and there are 12 of them, so that brought us down to 112. Still too many. After that, I took off the auction models, anything that wasn't already checked off, that is, and there were 7 of them, so now we're down to 105. Progress, but still way too many horses. So then I started getting into the more subjective categories. I took off vintage models next. So any mold that is vintage and really not super popular. Like Lady Faye's got to stay, maybe the Fighting Stallion, except for the auction, but a lot of the other vintage molds, I just don't see them using. So that took off 59 horses, leaving us with 46. We're really starting to make progress here. So after that, I decided that I should probably remove any molds that are just way too hot right now, things that are way too popular. And I kind of was a little wishy-washy on that one. I only removed 4 horses, so didn't help me a whole lot, quite frankly. Now, the category that did help was ones that just weren't popular enough. I couldn't see them really having a lot of people want multiple copies of it. Now, if your favorite mold is in here, I'm sorry. I'm not meaning as an insult to any of these molds. For instance, one of the ones I took off were the spirit models, so Rain and Boomerang. And I think they're adorable. But because of their kind of cartoony features, which is precisely what they're supposed to be, I didn't see that being one that Breyer would pick for the surprise. All told, there were 13 of those that I took off the list, which leaves us with 29. And now we hit the really, really subjective category, because the next one was just which ones, by my gut reaction, did I believe were not going to happen. And there were 9 of those that I took off. For instance, this is where I took off Weather Girl. While I don't want to just categorically say Breyer's never going to reuse a treasure hunt horse, I do think it's kind of unlikely. So this is where that disappeared. That left me with 20. And 20 is a number I can work with. Before I tell you which of those 20 are really my top choices, I thought I'd talk briefly about my second theory. This one is definitely a conspiracy theory. I have no basis that this will occur other than the title Breyer has used for the surprise this year. Rotating draft. Breyer explained it on their website. A rotating draft is a beer that cycles in and out. There's something different every so often. But horse people hear draft and think of drafters. And that's where my mind went. I started to think that what if, instead of doing one mold in 5 different colors or 4 different colors or whatever, Breyer did one color on 5 or 6 molds. So, I want to be really clear that I don't think this is going to happen. I believe that since they do have to mass produce these, it would be way more difficult to do that. It would also have a little less of a surprise when you picked up your horse, because the shape and feel of that bag would be different based on which draft it was. But just, on the thought that maybe Breyer has decided to throw us a little loop this year, I thought I'd have a little bit of fun and go through which molds they could potentially use. So I started with the same criteria, and I marked off all but 105 models. That's where we hit the ones that were in the auction. So from there, my criteria was slightly different. For instance, with vintage models, I didn't take off quite as many. There were about 3 or 4 of them that I left because they were vintage drafters. So at that point, I have 49. When it came to the 2 popular models, I only took off 3. I believe I left a different drafter. My thought is I left Othello. The not popular enough, I took off 13, which left me with 33. Then was the extra category. I took off anything that wasn't a drafter or couldn't reasonably be seen as a drafter. For instance, Vermeer is a Frisian. It's not really a draft, it's a carriage breed, it's closer to a sport breed, but it's got feathers, and I could see Breyer kind of sneaking Frisians in as drafts, since it's kind of a loose definition. All told, once I removed anything that was still left on the list that wasn't a drafter, I was left with 8 models. That's definitely something I could work with. So, which models did I have left? I'm going to start with what was left on the list of draft horses that could be used if they did a kind of combined different mold surprise model. Like I said, there's only 8. It starts off with the Belgian, the original vintage Hess mold Belgian, the Cleveland Bay, the Clydesdale Stallion, the one with the bobs, Goffert, Othello, Roy the Belgian, Vermeer, and Wixom. Quite frankly, any of those would make an excellent drafter surprise. And I will say that until a couple days ago when Breyer released the Brishin auction model, one of my top choices in the drafter mold list was Brishin. I really thought that he would be a perfect addition to a surprise like that. But if I had to go with my gut and say which ones of those would they do if they did a group of only drafters, I marked out the Old Belgian, the Cleveland Bay, Goffert, and Wixom. All of that to say, my draft list is just kind of me chatting. I have absolutely no belief that they'll do that for real, although I'm not gonna lie, I would kind of enjoy it. So, that said, now we're down to the picks from the normal, everyday, scientific, not so scientific Breyer list. I said a minute ago that we had 20 molds left, and that's still a lot, but I do think that once you see the list, you can kind of narrow it down. So at the top is the American Saddlebred Stallion. That would be the Clock Stallion from the 2000 collection. The Andalusian Mare, Ashquar the Arabian, Bobby Joe, Bristol, Carrick, the Cleveland Bay, Desatato, Dundee, the Andalusian Stallion, Emerson, Forever Sage, Goffert, Ruffian, the New Endurance Arabian, the Show Jumping Warmblood, Smart Chickalina, Strapless, True North, Vermeer, and Wixom. Now, I already kind of talked about why some of these got marked off on my previous list. I just don't know about Vermeer. I think Wixom, frankly, might be a little too big, that they'll want to keep the surprise model at more of a standard traditional instead of the mega traditional that she kind of is. And there's some of them that I just think would be a little more difficult. Ruffian has a base, and that has been a characteristic that rules horses out in the past, but then they threw us a loop with the Smarty Jones year. So I don't think that's disqualifying, but I don't think that it's super realistic. Kind of the same thing with Bobby Joe with that big size with the spinning. I think that might not happen, but frankly, that whole list could very well be. So I narrowed my list down to my top 4. The 4 that I think Breyer might be inclined to use, would hit that kind of sweet spot of not the most popular mold in the world, but certainly one that many people like, and ones that haven't seen just tons and tons and tons of color. Now, some of these have been done in a number of different models, but there's some more room to explore. So, here is what I have gone with. My first, and these are in no particular order right yet, but the first one off of that list that I think Breyer might use is the Andalusian Mare. She was Premier Club a few years ago at this point. She's lovely. They have released her separately without the foal in the past. So it could be one of those Giselle and Jillian situations like from a couple years ago. I think she's kind of in their realm of popularity to work. The next one is the Cleveland Bay. And this one I know sometimes isn't quite as popular, but he is sufficiently popular, I think, to sustain a surprise model crowd. He has different mane and tail patterns. There's a loose mane, loose tail, and my guess is that they can be combined, although I don't know that Breyer's done it yet. And he is kind of, sort of, maybe technically a draft. So I could see him being their little nod to drafts. Of course, this is Breyer, and I can see them using rotating draft as a cute name and it having nothing to do with draft horses. So on that note, my next pick is True North. He's still pretty new. He's pretty popular, but not crazy so. And he really hasn't had a lot of different colors done on him yet. So I can see Breyer using him as the rotating draft surprise and using some funky colors or doing a decorator on him, something like that. Finally, and I know I've used this pick before and I don't care, I still think that he is due for a surprise model use, and that is Smart Chickalina. This one definitely falls into the category of Breyer is using rotating draft as a name and a name only, but this horse has been used many times at BreyerFest. You can see this is even the volunteer model from just a few years ago. He has quite a lot of colors already out, but not so many that they couldn't find new things to do with him. And he's sufficiently popular, while not being one that would absolutely cause the tents to fall down like, say, Hamilton. Given that, and given these 4, I am going to make a final selection, final pick, but I will stay to put that little asterisk by it, because if the horse I choose winds up in the auction lineup, I will immediately switch to one of the other 3 that I've held up for you today. So which one do I think it is? I really think, just my gut feeling, if I had to nail it down, that it's going to be the Andalusian Mare. That's just who I think it's going to be. There's nothing else for it. I can't tell you why I think this one over, say, the Cleveland Bay. I don't know. But this is where I'm putting my money. My gambling here is on this one. I would like to know which ones you think will be the surprise model. Let me know in the comments. If you haven't subscribed, please go ahead and do so. That way you can keep up with me when we start, heading to BreyerFest, which is only in a couple of weeks. And let me know if there's anything else you'd like to hear about, or if you have any questions. Follow me on Instagram, because that way you'll be able to keep up with me a little more closely while I'm at the park. And I will talk to you guys next time. Bye! Okay, are you going to pick one? Are you going to pick one out? Go ahead, sniff one. Okay, that's it. That's your pick. Good girl.